There is something you have been holding in. You probably know exactly what it is without me having to describe it. The conversation you have been postponing, the answer you have not given, the thing you have been sitting with privately while the situation it belongs to continues developing without your direct input. And for a period of time this week, that holding felt like the right call. The guidance was to wait, to observe, to let the perceptual fog of Mercury retrograde in Pisces settle before moving, to draft the message without sending it, to resist the impulse to act from peak emotional activation. That guidance was correct for the days it was given. March 2nd was genuinely a day to hold back, to let the urgency run without converting it directly into action, to protect the situation from the specific damage that impulsive communication under a distorted perceptual environment produces. March 3rd is different. The energy has shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that resolves the Mercury retrograde conditions. Those are still present and still relevant, but in a specific and important direction. The lunar energy that has been building internal pressure is now orienting toward expression and outward movement. What was building inside is pressing toward the outside, and the silence that felt like strategic patience 2 days ago is beginning to produce a different effect. It is beginning to create distance. It is beginning to read to other people and to the situations themselves as something other than thoughtful restraint. And in some cases it is beginning to cost you things that further silence will not recover. If you continue avoiding the central conversation that this week has been building toward, and you probably know which one it is, something starts slipping. That is the core message of today. The sliding window between strategic patience and costly avoidance is closing. Where you're sitting right now, on March 3rd, is at that edge. What you do in the next 24 to 48 hours will determine which side of the edge you land on. Understanding why this shift is happening requires a clear look at what Mercury retrograde in Pisces actually does over time, because it does not operate uniformly throughout its duration. The early days of a Mercury retrograde tend to produce the most disorienting conditions, the most intense perceptual blur, the highest volume of unexpected returns and communication disruptions, the deepest confusion between what you are feeling and what is actually true about a situation. That early intensity is why the guidance last week was so strongly oriented toward pause and observation. The conditions were not reliable enough for careful, consequential communication to proceed well. As the retrograde continues, something specific happens. The disorienting noise of the early window does not entirely resolve. Mercury is still retrograde, and the Pisces influence is still dissolving boundaries between emotional interpretation and objective reality. But the initial overwhelming quality of it settles into a more navigable pattern. You begin to be able to distinguish more clearly between what Mercury retrograde is generating and what the actual situation requires. The genuine unresolved matters become more visible, more clearly separated from the static that the retrograde was producing around them. What is happening on March 3rd is that the genuinely unresolved matters are becoming impossible to manage around through continued silence. Mercury retrograde in Pisces brings unresolved communication back repeatedly. This is one of its primary mechanisms. It does not let things stay buried through inaction. It cycles them back through your awareness, through your conversations, through your circumstances, until they receive the genuine engagement they have been asking for. And the cycling intensifies over time rather than easing. The conversation you did not have yesterday is closer to the surface today. The answer you have not given is becoming more conspicuous by its absence. The unfinished agreement is generating increasing uncertainty in the other party that they are beginning to respond to in their own ways. Silence has a communicative function. You already know this. When you do not respond to something, the absence of response communicates something to the person waiting for it, and what it communicates shifts over time. In the early days of a delay, silence communicates that you need time, that you are processing, that your response is coming but requires thought. That reading of the silence has a limited shelf life. After a certain number of days, the same silence begins communicating something else. Uncertainty about whether you will engage at all, possible confirmation of whatever the other person's fear or suspicion was, a signal that the matter is not being taken seriously, or that the relationship or agreement is not being prioritized. You have been in the early days of that silence for most of this week. March 3rd is where the shift happens, where the silence stops communicating patience and starts communicating something you probably do not intend it to communicate. There are several specific scenarios where this becomes most relevant today, and it is worth walking through them concretely. The delayed response to someone who is waiting for your answer. A person who asked you something meaningful, something that requires a real answer, not a deflection, and who has been waiting for that answer while the week has moved forward. Under Mercury retrograde's influence, it is easy to rationalize the continued delay by telling yourself you are still processing, still waiting for clarity, still not sure. And that rationalization may have been entirely accurate earlier this week. Today it is less accurate. The person waiting for your answer is not sitting in a neutral state of patience. They are inside their own emotional and perceptual experience of your silence, and Mercury retrograde in Pisces is running through their system too, which means your silence is being interpreted through their fears and projections rather than through a neutral and patient waiting. The story they are constructing about what your silence means may be significantly more dramatic than the actual situation warrants. Your continued silence is feeding that story. An answer, even an incomplete one, even one that honestly acknowledges that you do not have full clarity yet, stops feeding that story. The unspoken resentment in a relationship that has been building through avoidance. If there is something in a close relationship, romantic, familial, friendship, that has been sitting in the subtext for the past week or longer, today that subtext is pressing closer to the surface than it has been. The unspoken resentment does not stay contained indefinitely. It finds expression through the texture of ordinary interactions, through tone, through what you do not say, through the quality of presence or absence you bring to the relationship. The other person is registering that texture, even if neither of you is naming it directly. And under Mercury retrograde in Pisces, where emotional sensitivity is elevated and projection is running high, they are likely constructing a specific interpretation of that texture that has its own emotional logic. Allowing the resentment to continue expressing through subtext rather than through direct communication is not protecting the relationship. It is allowing the relationship to be shaped by the unspoken version of the problem rather than by any of your genuine intentions. The unfinished agreement between you and someone else, professional or personal, where terms were left ambiguous and neither party has moved to clarify them. Ambiguity in agreements has a natural expiration date, beyond which it stops being open and starts being problematic. Depending on what the agreement involves, the ambiguity may already be producing downstream effects. Decisions being made on both sides that are proceeding on potentially different assumptions about what was agreed. The longer the ambiguity persists without being addressed, the more those downstream effects accumulate, and the harder the eventual clarification conversation becomes. Moving to clarify now, even if the clarification requires acknowledging that you are not yet fully certain about your own position, is better than allowing the ambiguity to produce consequences that then require repair. The conversation you have been rehearsing internally without initiating externally. The one that has been cycling in your mind all week. The version where you say the thing, the version where they respond, the various ways the exchange might go. If that rehearsal has been running for several days without resulting in the actual conversation, Mercury retrograde in Pisces is doing something specific with the rehearsal that is worth understanding. Pisces amplifies emotional narrative. The longer an unspoken conversation runs internally, the more it accumulates emotional weight. The fears about how it might go, the hopes about what it might resolve, the imagined responses that have nothing to do with what the other person would actually say. By the time you initiate the actual conversation, you are not starting from a neutral position. You are starting from inside an elaborate internal construction that has been running for days, and that construction will inevitably shape how you hear and interpret the real responses you receive. The longer you wait, the more elaborate the internal construction becomes, and the harder it is to hear the actual conversation through it. Today is the day to start moving toward these conversations, not to charge into them from the most emotionally activated state available. That guidance from earlier this week still applies in principle, but to take the first concrete step toward engagement rather than continued avoidance. The tactical guidance for March 3rd is specific and worth following closely. Choose clarity over avoidance. This is the primary orientation of the day, replacing the primary orientation of the last 2 days, which was restraint over impulse. The restraint was correct. The window of restraint as the dominant strategy has closed for most of the situations you are carrying. Clarity, even partial clarity, even imperfect clarity, is now more useful to both you and the people you are in situation with than continued strategic silence. Keep communication short and direct. Mercury retrograde in Pisces distorts long and emotionally complex communication most severely. The message that runs to 4 paragraphs of context setting and qualification and emotional processing has the most surface area for misinterpretation. The message that says the essential thing in 2 or 3 sentences gives Mercury retrograde the least to work with. Identify the functional core of what you need to communicate, the actual thing, stripped of all the surrounding material, and lead with that. The surrounding material can follow if it is genuinely necessary, but in most cases the essential statement is sufficient, and everything else is noise that increases the probability of misunderstanding. Avoid emotional over-explaining. When you have been holding something in for a period of time, there is a natural impulse to explain the full context when you finally speak, to give all of the background, to account for all of the nuance, to make sure the other person understands everything that has been going on internally for you. That impulse is understandable and in many contexts appropriate. Under Mercury retrograde in Pisces, it backfires. Long explanations give the listener many more points at which their own emotional interpretation can enter and reshape what you are saying. By the end of a long and emotionally complex message, what the other person has heard may be quite different from what you intended to communicate. Say the essential thing. Stop there. Let them respond. The rest of the conversation can follow from their response rather than from your preloaded explanation. Say only what needs to be said today. This is a discipline that will feel restrictive, particularly if you have been holding something in for several days and the pressure toward full expression is running high. The restriction serves you. The portion of what you want to say that actually needs to be said is smaller than the full content of what you have been accumulating. Finding that portion, the true core of what the situation requires, and communicating that clearly is more effective than releasing the full accumulated weight of the week into a single conversation that then needs to be untangled. If you are uncertain about where to start a communication, begin with a question rather than a statement. A question invites engagement. It opens space for the other person to participate rather than respond. It also gives you information about where they are, about what their understanding of the situation is, about what the actual gap is between your position and theirs. That information shapes a more accurate and effective response than the one you would send based purely on your current assumptions. If the conversation you are initiating is the kind that carries significant emotional stakes, choose voice over text where possible. Mercury retrograde in Pisces operates most disruptively on written communication, where the absence of tone, facial expression, and immediate feedback creates the widest space for misinterpretation. A conversation that happens in real time, where both parties can hear tone, can ask for clarification in the moment, can respond to each other's actual presence rather than to an interpretation of their words, has a significantly higher probability of producing genuine understanding than an exchange of written messages through which Mercury retrograde is filtering every word. If voice communication is not available or appropriate for the situation, and written communication is what the situation requires, then apply the drafting practice from yesterday with an important modification. Draft the message, let it sit for a minimum of 2 hours, read it again, and cut it by a third. Whatever feels important enough to include in the first draft, but does not survive the cut, is likely to be emotional loading rather than essential content. What remains after the cut is closer to the genuine communication the situation requires. The timing guidance for today is specific. Act within the next 24 to 48 hours. This window is more precisely defined than earlier guidance in the week, because the cost of silence has now become real, and the window for addressing the relevant situations before they develop further is genuinely limited. 24 to 48 hours means by the end of March 4th or, at the latest, March 5th. Not open-ended. Not when the timing feels perfect. The timing will not feel perfect under Mercury retrograde in Pisces. That is a feature of this period, not a temporary condition waiting to resolve before you act. Acting within conditions that are imperfect but manageable is the correct posture for March 3rd. Waiting for conditions that are ideal is waiting for something that is not available in this window. Acting within 24 to 48 hours also does not mean acting in the next 24 to 48 minutes. The guidance is against impulsive action that converts emotional pressure directly into communication without any processing layer. The processing layer is still important. What changes today is that the processing layer serves a different function. Instead of being a full pause and observation period, it becomes a preparation step before communication that needs to happen. You process in order to identify the essential thing to say, to find the clearest and most direct version of the communication, to choose the appropriate channel and moment. And then you communicate. The distinction between strategic patience and costly avoidance is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to confuse the two, particularly when avoidance feels familiar and comfortable. Strategic patience is a deliberate choice made with awareness of why waiting serves the situation. It has a defined endpoint, a specific condition or time frame after which the waiting converts to action. Costly avoidance is waiting that has lost its strategic justification and is being maintained by inertia, discomfort with confrontation, or the hope that the situation will somehow resolve itself without your direct engagement. If your waiting this week started as strategic patience, which it should have, because the guidance earlier in the week was specifically oriented toward that, it may have already converted to costly avoidance without you fully registering the transition. March 3rd is the day to check that. Ask yourself honestly, is there still a genuine strategic reason for continuing to hold back on this particular communication or decision? Or has the holding back become its own pattern, sustained by the discomfort of initiating rather than by any remaining useful purpose? The situations that genuinely benefit from continued waiting are those where the information you need has not yet arrived, where the other party's response or a relevant external development is genuinely pending and your action depends on it. The situations that no longer benefit from waiting are those where the only thing preventing movement is your own internal reluctance or the residual pull of the Mercury retrograde guidance to pause. If the information is available, if the situation is clear enough to speak to, if the person is waiting for your engagement, those situations have exited the window where continued silence serves. Mercury retrograde in Pisces will continue surfacing the unresolved material. It does this not as punishment, but as a mechanical function of this period. The past returns, the unfinished asks for completion, the suppressed presses toward expression. Every day you continue to hold the communication that needs to happen, Mercury retrograde will bring it back around in some form. Through a memory, through a related conversation that touches the same territory, through circumstances that make the unaddressed thing more visible and more pressing. The cycle continues until the genuine engagement happens. Acting now, within the next 24 to 48 hours, with the clarity and directness the situation requires, is how you complete the cycle rather than continuing to live inside it. The silence was useful, when it protected you from making communication errors under peak emotional distortion. That function has been served. The protection it was offering has been largely exhausted, and the cost of extending it past its useful duration is now active. Distance is growing where presence was needed. Interpretation is filling the space where your direct voice belongs. Someone or something is developing in a direction that assumes your continued silence as its baseline, and that development will require more effort to redirect the longer it continues. Today the energy is shifting outward. The internal pressure that has been building for days is finding its natural orientation toward expression, and working against that orientation takes more energy than working with it. You have held what needed to be held. The discipline of the last 2 days was appropriate, and it protected you from several categories of communication damage that are easy to create in Mercury retrograde conditions. That discipline has done its work. Now the work is different. Now the work is taking what you have processed through the silence, the clearer reading of what the situation actually requires, the identification of the essential thing that needs to be said, the separation of what is real from what Mercury retrograde's distortion added to it, and moving that into direct, clear, brief communication within the next 24 to 48 hours. The silence served its purpose. The moment for it is passing. The energy is outward now, and what needs to be expressed is ready to be expressed. Do it clearly. Do it briefly. Do it soon. The cost of not doing it is beginning to accumulate faster than the cost of doing it imperfectly under still imperfect conditions. Act within 24 to 48 hours. Say the essential thing. Let the conversation begin. The rest can be navigated as it unfolds, but it cannot begin until you start it.